Ready for Daniel? Yes? Okay, we're looking at part 1. We'll be doing 3 parts today, 3 different chapters. And part 1 is introducing Daniel. We need to know who he is and why he is so important. And he really is very important. So let's look at our historical context. In 970 to 931 BCE, King Solomon reigned over a united Israel. Well, he married multiple foreign wives. You all know that. Then they brought paganism into Israel, which brought a curse upon the land of Israel. In 930 BCE, Solomon died. His son, Rehoboam, took over Israel. However, he was not so great as a leader, and he excessively taxed, and the people rebelled. So 10 tribes that were in that area rebelled and followed Jeroboam, who took over the northern kingdom, which was now called, well, it was formerly Israel, now called the northern kingdom. Rehoboam kept control over the tribes of Judah, which is southern kingdom, and that's Judah and Benjamin, both tribes. 752 to 742 BCE, Menahem seized the throne by assassination, and he ruled Israel harshly. He entered an alliance with the massive Assyrian Empire, and we know the Assyrian Empire from the story of Jonah. He went to Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and he warned them to get their act together and repent. They did, but temporarily. When they went back to their old ways, then they were again an enemy of Israel. Well, here's Menahem, who's ruling Israel, and he goes to his enemy and makes a deal. He pays them a large tribute in exchange for military protection. And you're going to see that in 2 Kings 15, 19 to 20. Israel then became a vassal state of the Assyrian Empire. That meant the Assyrian Empire controlled and ruled over them, even if they considered themselves a separate state. In 725 to 722 BCE, Israel's capital city, Samaria, was besieged by the Assyrians for 3 years. Israel collapsed, and the people were all deported to Assyria in 722 BCE. That was the first deportation of exiles. But then there's a second one. 612 to 609, Babylon attacked Assyrians' capital city, Nineveh. It weakened their Assyrian Empire. Then, 605 BCE, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar captured the Assyrian Empire. Judah then became a vassal state. So now we have Israel a vassal state, Judah's a vassal state. They're all under the control of other empires. Daniel is about age 15 when he was exiled to Babylon. This was the first deportation of exiles from Judah. And he was deported with all the elite youth of royal lineage. We see that in Daniel 1, 1 to 6. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the finest. He wanted the handsome ones. He wanted the strong youth. That's who he deported in this first deportation. 597 BCE, Ezekiel was exiled to Babylon in the second deportation from Judah, including the king of Judah, royal officials, priests, and craftsmen. We see that referenced in 2 Kings 24. Ezekiel prophesied to the exiles. 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar then besieged Jerusalem for 18 months. He attacked. Finally, Solomon's temple was burned to the ground. That was in 586. Most people were exiled to Babylon. There were a few that stayed behind. This is seen in 2 Kings 25 in Jeremiah 52, in Lamentations 1-5. And who else came along? Mordecai and Esther. They were part of that. 582 BCE, Jeremiah prophesied before, during, and after Jerusalem fell in 586 BCE. He lived just north of Jerusalem. He was forced into exile from Judah to Egypt. He prophesied that Israel and Judah would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. You can see his prophecy in Jeremiah 25:11-12. So who's Babylon? Why are they so important in this story? We hear about them after the worldwide flood. Genesis 10:1-9, we see that Noah has fathered Ham, who fathered Cush, who fathered Nimrod, that the Bible describes as a mighty hunter. Genesis 10:10, Nimrod's kingdom included Babel. And, you know, we have to understand the Hebrew language. That B is sometimes represented as a V. So we see it interchanged with Babel or Bavel. Okay? I think we'll see it mostly on the slides as Bavel. And that was in the land of Shinar. Then Genesis 11:1, the entire earth spoke the same language. 11:4, they decided to make a name for themselves and build a tower to reach into the heavens, into God's domain. Imagine, they decided that they were going to get to heaven without God. They were just going to shove him out, I guess. But they figured they don't need him. They're just going to work together, and they'll get up there eventually. That was Babel, the Tower of Babel, or Bavel. The word means confused. Genesis 11:6-9, Adonai said, "Look, the people are united. They all have a single language. And see what they're starting to do? At this rate, nothing that they set out to accomplish will be impossible for them." Do you understand what he just said? When they're united in purpose, they can do anything. That's the same thing that we need to know now. When we are united in purpose, whether it's a good purpose or an evil purpose, the strength of the unity will accomplish the task. So he says, "Come, let's go down and confuse their language so that they won't understand each other's speech." Who is he talking about? Come, let's go down. Who's let's go down? Well, we have angelic beings that are ministers of God's purposes. Come on, guys, let's go down. We're going to take care of this problem. We're going to confuse their language so they won't understand each other's speech. So from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth, and they stopped building the city. For this reason, it is called Bavel, which is confusion. Because there, Adonai confused the language of the whole earth, and from there, Adonai scattered them all over the earth. Again, Bavel and Babel, or Babylon, this is coming from that. That's the same Hebrew word. Well, we know about the judgment upon Israel that came about because of Solomon and the multiple wives and the paganism and the curse on the land. Well, even back before that, during the time of Abraham, Nimrod was a tyrannical ruler over Babylon, who tried to turn the people away from God. Centuries later, Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt to the foot of Mount Sinai. At that location, he then instructed them to observe a Sabbath of the land every 7 years. Do you realize that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai? All the way back. It was a pretty important order. Observe the Sabbath. And the land was given a Sabbath. And he said, you were to observe it every 7 years, to sow and reap for 6 years, and let the land rest in the 7th year. You can look that up in Leviticus 25, 1-7. However, for 70 sabbatical years, the Israelites failed to let the land rest. So God removed them from their land. 70 years of exile would repay the land for the 70 missed Sabbaths, and that is why they ended up in Babylon. Did you know that? It's about the Sabbath. Sabbath is key to all the things that God instructs to us. Now, we look at Babylon a little bit more. Babylon became a small port town on the Euphrates River. It grew into one of the largest cities of the ancient world. King Nebuchadnezzar II ruled the Babylonian Empire for 43 years. That started in 605 to 604 BCE. He was creating the most powerful and religious empire. Yes, religious, but religious for the pagan gods, okay? Now, God used Nebuchadnezzar II. He was used to execute the judgment over the Israelites because they disregarded the Sabbaths of the land. Under Moses, the Israelites had been freed from Pharaoh and his Egyptian gods. Now, in Babylon, they were subjected to King Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian gods. They just went from one pantheon of gods to another pantheon of gods. And for that, they were exiled. All right, who's Daniel? Well, let's look at some verses. Daniel 1:3. He's the son of Israel. He is from royal descent and nobility. He's royalty somewhere in his family line. He's also from a priestly descent. Daniel 1:4 says he is a youth, he's handsome, proficient in all wisdom, knowledgeable, intelligent, and capable of serving in the king's palace. That is a quote from the scriptures. Daniel 1:6, he is from the people of Judah. And these were his friends. We have Daniel and then Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You probably know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Those were the Babylonian names. Alrighty, how about the other people that knew Daniel? What did they have to say about him? Ezekiel talked about him because, he was a contemporary of Daniel. He describes Daniel as righteous. That's Ezekiel 14 and 20. And he says Daniel is wise, Ezekiel 28:3. Well, when the scripture describes someone as righteous, what that means is that they follow the commandments. So he was a commandment keeper, okay? Yeshua refers to Daniel. He tells us that he's a prophet. That's Matthew 24:15. So we have a pretty good idea about Daniel. He is highly esteemed from the people who know him. He lived from 620 to 638 BCE. In 605 BCE, at about 15 years old, he and his friends were exiled to Babylon by the king, Nebuchadnezzar. He was trained for 3 years to serve with the king's wise men. You've heard of the wise men? Those are the Magi. The Magi. The wise men were the ones that the king would seek for counsel, the wise men. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel became the prime minister over all the satraps. That is a word for governors of the Assyrian provinces. He was the chief over all the Magi. Daniel 2:48. He worked under Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. He worked under Darius the Mede. He became one of the 3 leaders over the entire Median Empire. We see that in Daniel 5. Under Cyrus the Great, Daniel served the highest position in the Persian Empire. He was highly esteemed. He was highly trusted. He was given the highest positions of anybody in the land. Now, about the book of Daniel, this is pretty interesting. Daniel's book begins and ends in the Hebrew language. That's the language of Israel and Judah. Well, he came from Israel. He came from Judah. That was his native language. So he begins his writing in the first chapter in Hebrew. But somewhere in the middle of, well, in the beginning of the second chapter, he switches to Aramaic. Why is that? Well, we'll see later the context of why that happened. You've heard of the Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. If you look at the Septuagint, you find out that the book of Daniel was translated into Greek, but it has about 50 extra verses. Where did those come from? Then we have 8 manuscript copies of the book of Daniel, some in Hebrew and Aramaic. We have 2 Greek manuscripts only, and they are the book of Daniel with the extra verses, just 2 copies, 2 Greek manuscripts. The other manuscripts were in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls contain that many manuscripts, which told us this was a popular book. It was well read, it was well studied in the time of Yeshua. Daniel's book is referenced by the 1st century Jewish Roman historian named Flavius Josephus in his book called The Antiquity of the Jews. It was widely read and studied in the 1st century. Chapter 1 through 6 is all historical records. Chapter 7 to 12 contains prophecies. We will find out as we get further into the study that chapter 1 through 6, although it is historical, it is not chronological. Some of the books are a little mixed up for a reason. Okay, let's go on to the prophecies. Daniel described a vision of the Son of Man. That's in Daniel 7. In Daniel 8 and 9, he had visits from Gabriel. Gabriel? How many people had visits from Gabriel? Zechariah, Miriam, and Daniel had 2 visits from Gabriel. Gabriel's pretty important. Then there was the other angel. We've heard of Michael, the archangel. Well, he actually had some communications with Daniel, and that's Daniel 10. Daniel prophesied the fall of Babylon by the Medo-Persians. He also prophesied the fall of the Medo-Persians by Alexander the Great. He prophesied the split of the Greek Empire, which was Alexander's empire. He also prophesied the Maccabean revolt against Antiochus IV. Daniel foretold about the Roman Empire, the coming of the Messiah, the time of Yeshua's crucifixion, and the time of the Gentiles. Can you imagine one person who's seen all of that? And he also prophesied things that are still unfolding regarding Europe, Rome, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, and the time just before Yeshua returns. This is an important prophet. His prophecies are still unfolding. Now we look at Isaiah. He prophesied. This was in 740 to 701 BCE. He was busy prophesying about all sorts of things. He says in 39, 5 to 7, Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear what Adonai Tzava'ot says. The day will come when everything in your palace, along with everything your ancestors stored up until today, will be carried off to Bavel. Nothing will be left, says Adonai. They will carry off some of your descendants, your own offspring, and they will be made eunuchs, serving in the palace of the king of Bavel." Well, this practice of becoming a eunuch was very common during that period. The eunuchs were castrated in order to have no interest in romantic things. They could just focus on their job. So it was common in Babylon to castrate the slaves. It was common for them to castrate those who worked for the king. so they could have 100% focus on their job. We see this in Josephus's writing, Antiquities, chapter 10. For 3 years, Daniel had to train under the chief eunuch of Nebuchadnezzar. We see that in Daniel 1:3. So all of those people who served the king, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were all eunuchs. They had to be. Otherwise, they couldn't have the job. Let's look at Amos 3:7. This is one you'll want to memorize. Adonai God does nothing without revealing his plan to his servants, the prophets. He always tells his prophets ahead of time, and then the prophets are to prophesy what God said. We have modern-day prophets today, and I won't go into all of that now, but we do have them. You can find a lot of them on YouTube, by the way. Daniel 6:20 to 538 BCE, that's his lifespan. He was from a priestly family, and the Talmud states that Daniel's lineage was the Zadokite priests. Wow. You know about them, the Zadokite priests. Jeremiah, living from 650 to 570 BCE, was also from a priestly lineage. He was living in Anatoth. Jeremiah 1:1 says that. And if you look at that word, Anatoth, you'll find it in Joshua 21:18, which tells us that it was a Levitical city. So Jeremiah couldn't have lived there unless he was one of the Levites. Daniel was living in Jerusalem, while Jeremiah was living just a few miles northeast of Jerusalem. Jeremiah was about 30 years old. He was 30 years older than Daniel. So at the time Daniel was exiled at 15, Jeremiah would have been 45. Daniel knew of Jeremiah's reputation as a local prophet. He also knew about Jeremiah's warning to Judah. And here's the warning. Jeremiah 25:1-11. This is the word that came to Yirmiyahu, that's Jeremiah, concerning all the people of Yehuda in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Yoshiyahu, that's Josiah, king of Yehuda. This was also the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Bavel. Therefore, here is what Adonai says. Because you haven't paid attention to what I've been saying, I'm going to send for all the families of the north, says Adonai, and for my servant Nebuchadnezzar. What? Servant? Yes, because he has to carry out the plans of God, to judge Israel. He's a servant, the king of Bavel, and bring them against this land, against its inhabitants, against all the surrounding nations. This entire land will become a ruin, a waste, and these nations will serve the king of Bavel for how many years? 70. 70 years. Remember that. Remember that when we look later in Daniel 9 about the prophecy of the 70 sevens. It's related to the 70 years of exile. Okay, here in 2 Chronicles 36:18-21, we see about the 70 years. All the articles in the house of God, great and small, the supplies in the house of Adonai, and the supplies of the king and his leading men, all these he brought to Bavel. Do you realize he took the things out of the temple? The holy artifacts, he took them for himself. He brought them to Bavel. Then they burned down the house of God, broke down the wall of Jerusalem, put to flames all its palaces, and destroyed everything in it of worth. Those who had escaped the sword, he carried off to Bavel. They became slaves to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. Thus was fulfilled the word of Adonai spoken by Jeremiah. until the land, this is what Jeremiah said, until the land has been paid her Shabbats. For as long as it lay desolate, it kept Shabbat until 70 years had passed. Isn't that interesting? When we don't keep Shabbat, we have a debt accumulating. We have a Shabbat debt. That's what we see here. So the years that we didn't keep Shabbat, we've got to go back to the Lord and say, Lord, what do I do about this debt? I have a debt to you I have to pay. Tell me how I make it right. Okay? They had to pay back the Sabbaths of the land. 2 Kings 24, 8-17 says, Jehoiakim was 18 years old when he began his reign. He ruled in Jerusalem for 3 months. He did what was evil from Adonai's perspective, following the example of everything his father had done. It was then that the officers of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, marched on Jerusalem and laid siege to the city, carried away from there all the treasures in the house of Adonai and the treasures in the royal palace. He cut in pieces all the articles of gold which Shlomo, that's Solomon, king of Israel, had made in the temple of Adonai. As Adonai had said would happen, he carried all Jerusalem away captive, all the princes, all the bravest soldiers, 10,000 captives. And then we have all these other ones, all the craftsmen and the metal workers. No one was left except the poorest people of the land. He only wanted the prosperous ones. He was going to take them to Babylon. We don't care about the poor people. Leave those people behind. Well, let's introduce Nebuchadnezzar. This is taken from internationalstandardbible.com. Of all the heathen monarchs mentioned by name in the scriptures, Nebuchadnezzar is the most prominent and the most important. The prophecies of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and the last chapters of Kings and Chronicles centered about his life, and he stands preeminent among the foes of the kingdom of God. Nebuchadnezzar succeeded his father on the throne of Babylon in 604 BC, and he reigned until 561 BC. He was a very religious man, probably excelling all who had preceded him in the building of temples, in the institution of offerings, and the observance of all the ceremonies connected with the worship of his gods. He was a religious man. We can be religious and not know God, right? That was Nebuchadnezzar. So he was so religious that he wanted to rebuild that which was precious from a long time ago. Josephus wrote about this. He wrote about the Tower of Babel, that it was built in Assyria by Nimrod in rebellion against God. We talked about that earlier. But there were continual military campaigns against Babylon, and this destroyed the tower. However, Nebuchadnezzar didn't want that destroyed. He wanted to have that back. He rebuilt it in 610 BCE. It was overseen by King Nabopolassar and his son Nebuchadnezzar II. So father and son got together and said, we're going to rebuild it. The new Tower of Babel had been in place for just a few years before Daniel was exiled to Babylon. Perhaps some of the holy temple vessels were taken into the new tower. Can you imagine? The holy sacred vessels that were intended for the worship of the God of Israel were taken into the Tower of Babel? Really? Our next slide shows us a picture. The archaeologists confirm that there was a building that existed in Babel, a temple to Marduk, that was their chief god. The first tier of this temple was 110 feet tall. The second was 60 feet tall. And then we added other tiers, 20 feet on, 20 feet on, 20 feet on, another 20 feet. They're trying to reach heaven, aren't they? With the top being 60 feet tall. The temple was called Etemenanki. That means the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The ruins of this tower can still be seen today in Iraq. Now we get to begin with Daniel. That's all the history. Now we understand who's Daniel, where's he living, and who's he associating with. So we know he was living in Judah. That's the southern kingdom of Israel. He was there during the reign of the evil king, Jehoiakim. The king had mocked and defied the prophet Jeremiah. You don't do that. God does not put up with that. So that brought judgment upon the king. We see in Daniel 1, we start the story. Verse 1 to 2. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Yehuda, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And Adonai handed Jehoiakim, king of Yehuda, over to him, along with some of the articles from the house of God. He took them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the articles in the storehouse of his God. Daniel 1, 3-4. By the way, as you read through the booklet or as you watch the slides, the text that is in blue is a direct quote from the scriptures, okay? The things that are in black are commentary from me, and you'll see some that are pink or kind of a fuchsia color. Those are just text commentary within the body of the scripture, okay? Daniel 1, 3-4. The king ordered Ashpenaz, the eunuch, serving as his chief officer, to bring into the palace from the people of Israel some of royal or noble descent. They were to be boys without physical defect, handsome in appearance, versed in all kinds of wisdom, quick to learn, discerning, and having the capacity to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Kasdim. That means the Chaldeans. So this language in Babylon was called Akkadian. They also had another word for it, Chaldean. Both were the same language. Aramaic was the lingua franca that was used in trade and administration. So in the people's houses, they would be speaking Akkadian. In the courts, in the legal places, they would be speaking Aramaic, or they would be writing the documents in Aramaic. Thus, Daniel starts his book in Hebrew, but when he actually starts to talk about things that went on in the temple, in the court, he changes to Aramaic. Later, he goes back to Hebrew. Okay, so we see that shift. 3 different places. Hebrew first, then Aramaic, then finishing with Hebrew. Daniel 1, 5-8. The king assigned them a daily portion of his own food and the wine he drank. Well, it wasn't kosher. He was not concerned about eating pork, shellfish, lobster, all those things that are considered kosher. So Daniel said, nope, not eating it. They were to be cared for in this way for 3 years. Hey, if you go to the king's place and he serves you a feast of all of his delicacies, and you go, no, thank you, king's not going to be too happy. Going to be a little insulted, and that's what happened. It says, at the end of this time, they were to become the king's attendants. Among these, from the people of Yehuda, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officer gave them other names. To Daniel, which means God is my judge, he gave the name Belshazzar. Bel, the god of Babylon, Bel protects his life. To Hananiah, Shadrach, and Mishael, he says, you are going to be Meshach, Azariah, and Abednego. These new names evoked the Babylonian gods. That's why he renamed them. He didn't want to hear El, Daniel. El is like a name for God. He didn't want to hear Daniel. He had to change that. He didn't want to hear Hananiah. There's the name Yah. He didn't want to hear Mishael. There's the El. Nope, we got to get those names of God out of there. We've got to put in our own gods. That's why the renaming, okay? Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank, so he asked the chief officer to be excused from defiling himself. 9-13. God caused the chief officer to be kind and sympathetic toward Daniel. However, the chief officer said to Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king. After all, he has given you an allowance of food and drink. So if he were to see you boys looking worse than the others your age, you would be putting my own head in danger from the king." Then Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief officer had put in charge of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please try an experiment on your servants. For 10 days, have them give us only vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then see how we look and compare us with how the boys who eat the king's food look, and deal with your servants according to what you see." Well, he agreed. He agreed to do what they asked. He gave them a 10-day test. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and more robust than all the boys who were eating the king's food. So the guard took away their food and the wine that they were supposed to drink and gave them vegetables. By the way, one of the things that happened during those times, they would sacrifice meat to their idols. They would offer that meat, and then they would eat it. They would dedicate their wine to the gods, and then they would drink it. So you understand why Daniel said, "No thanks, not doing that." In the Greek Septuagint, it doesn't say vegetables. It says seeds or pulse. Some fish or other animals are not kosher, unclean, but all vegetables are kosher. So it's always safe to eat vegetables. If you're asked to bring a kosher meal, do the vegetables. To these 4 boys, God had given knowledge and skill in every aspect of learning and wisdom. Moreover, Daniel could understand all kinds of visions and dreams. Now, this idea of eating vegetables and water, it's called the Daniel fast. Have you heard of that? Vegetables and water, the Daniel fast. And did you know that clean eating sharpens mental acuity and spiritual acuity? Okay, that's why they said we're not eating those unclean things. Excuse me, tickle in my throat. Daniel 1:18-21. When the time the king had set for them to be presented came, which was 3 years, the chief officer presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. And when the king spoke with them, none was found among all of them to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. Excuse me. And in all matters requiring wisdom and understanding, whenever the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and exorcists in the entire kingdom. So Daniel remained there until the first year of King Koresh, that's Cyrus the Great. So he served various kings. Cyrus the Great was the final one he served. Cyrus founded the Persian Empire. He reigned from 559 to 530, and in 539 BCE, he conquered Babylon. In 538 BCE, he decreed that the Jewish exiles could return home. That was a big deal. So let's summarize this part. Nimrod is the great-grandson of Noah. Nimrod led the construction of the Tower of Babel. Babel was a place of wickedness and defiance against God. Now I have 7 waters. They're all in a row. God's people ignored the order to keep the land Sabbaths. Isaiah and Jeremiah delivered the warnings but were ignored. 70 missed land Sabbath years brought 70 years of exile. Prophetic warnings about the Babylonian exile came to pass. The Tower of Babel was destroyed due to multiple military campaigns against Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the tower. Nebuchadnezzar was God's servant. That's what he said in the scriptures. God's servant who delivered the judgment against Judah and Jerusalem for their disobedience. Daniel and his friends, all of royal descent, were among the first group of exiles to Babylon. They were chosen for their youth, their wisdom, and their royal and priestly bloodlines. Daniel and his friends maintained kosher diets, thus were endowed with supernatural wisdom and understanding. We're going to take a break now for about 10 minutes and then come back. We're going to resume with part 2. Part 2, you better buckle up. This one is very exciting. Okay, go ahead and take your break.